The storm hit harder than anything he had ever expected, roaring across the Pine Valley with a violent sweep that felt almost personal, like nature itself had decided to test him again. Corvin Holden had been through enough storms in life, his wife's sudden passing, the endless nights of balancing bills, and the heavy, crushing responsibility of raising his 8-year-old daughter, Marvi, alone. But nothing compared to the moment he realized the mountain trail had flooded behind him. The road had collapsed, and he and the CEO he had rescued were trapped in a remote cabin with no electricity, no signal, and a cold front dropping fast. And as the wind screamed against the splintering wood, he heard her quiet, trembling whisper that froze him more than the cold ever could. "Can I slip under your blanket? If you believe in kindness, second chances, and stories that remind us of humanity's power, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Touch of Kindness. Your support keeps these emotional stories alive." Corvin had only planned a quick detour. He had picked Marvi up from her Saturday reading club, and the two of them were driving through the mountain road toward home when he spotted a sleek black SUV half buried in mud. At first, he thought it was abandoned. But then he saw a woman in a torn suit, drenched, shivering, and desperately trying to free a stuck tire. Her makeup streaked, her phone clutched uselessly in her hand. She looked nothing like the powerful executive she actually was. Her name was Soraya Valloon, the newly appointed CEO of the Valloon Enterprise Group, a woman known in newspapers for her icy decisiveness and flawless composure. But what Corvin saw that afternoon was someone exhausted and human, someone who had been stranded alone long enough to break through her carefully crafted armor. He didn't have to help her. He didn't know who she was, and she didn't know who he was. But when Marvi tugged on his sleeve and whispered that the lady looked sad, Corvin knew stopping was the only choice. He managed to pull her vehicle free, but as they began to drive behind him toward the main road, the rain turned monstrous. The cliffside crumbled, and in a terrifying crash of mud, stone, and water, the road vanished entirely between them and safety. Corvin had to slam his brakes to keep from plunging over. With no signal and the storm swelling into something dangerous, he guided both vehicles to the only shelter he knew on the mountain, a small ranger cabin he remembered from years ago, back when his wife was still alive and they took nature trips as a family. By the time they reached the cabin, Soraya could barely feel her hands. Her lips had turned pale, her clothes soaked through, and her normally steady posture had weakened. Corvin's protective instincts rose in a way he hadn't felt since caring for his wife through her illness. Inside, the cabin was cold, stiff, and empty except for a wood-burning stove and a few dusty supplies. The grey daylight outside dimmed slowly into a storm-choked haze. Corvin lit the stove with practiced hands. Soraya watched him with a silent frustration lingering in her eyes, not at him but at her own helplessness. She wasn't used to depending on anyone. She certainly wasn't used to looking weak. But the storm didn't care about pride, and neither did the cold creeping into her bones. Marvi wrapped herself in Corvin's spare jacket, but kept glancing towards Soraya with the kind, curious compassion only children had. Corvin handed Soraya a blanket and gestured for her to sit closer to the stove. She nodded stiffly, still trembling. In the quiet, broken only by wind hammering the roof, he noticed something he hadn't expected, a faint vacancy in her gaze, like she wasn't just freezing from the outside. There was something heavy inside her, too. As the hours dragged on, daylight fading into a storm-dark afternoon, they warmed water, made instant soup from dusty packets, and tried to make the cabin feel like more than a wooden box in the middle of danger. Corvin kept busy, checking windows, feeding the fire, tucking Marvy into the corner bed he had cleared. Anything to keep control. Anything to keep fear from creeping in. Soraya sat on the floor close to the fire, hugging the blanket around herself, watching the flames with a hollow stillness. She had refused help earlier, insisting she was fine. But now she didn't protest when Corvin offered a thermal cloth to wrap around her feet. And that was when she finally spoke, not with strength, not with the smooth determination that filled her press conferences, but with a quiet honesty that startled even her. She told him she had lost everything that mattered outside her job. She told him she had given years to a company that saw her as a machine. She told him that today had been the anniversary of her mother's death, and she had tried to drive to the mountain overlook her mother used to love, but ended up trapped instead, drowning in guilt and grief she had never allowed herself to feel. Her voice cracked only once, but it was enough to reveal the truth. The strong woman on magazine covers was still human underneath. Corvin didn't interrupt. He understood loss. He understood loneliness. He understood the feeling of trying to hold an entire world together for the sake of others while secretly falling apart himself. In the dim cabin, two strangers shared a wordless connection built not on attraction but on pain and quiet endurance. But as night approached, the cabin temperature continued to drop. The storm wasn't letting up. The cold slithered in no matter how high the fire crackled. Corvin used his body heat to help Marvy stay warm, but there was only one proper blanket left, the one Soraya held wrapped around herself. He didn't plan to sleep. He needed to stay awake, to keep the fire alive, to make sure the roof didn't leak too much. But when the wind intensified and a loud crack sounded from outside, Soraya startled, violently. Her breath came out in fast, shallow bursts. The cold had pushed her body past shivering into something more dangerous. Corvin laid his only thick blanket near the fire, planning to sit beside it while she rested. But when he turned, Soraya's voice came out in a trembling whisper, barely audible over the storm. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't bold. It was raw fear mixed with embarrassment. "Can I slip under your blanket?" The request stunned him. Her eyes were downcast, her hands clutching the edge of the fabric around her shoulders. She looked nothing like a CEO, just a woman terrified of freezing in a lonely cabin far from anyone who cared. He nodded quietly and shifted to make room. She hesitated only a moment before sliding close enough for their shared warmth to matter. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. But when her shoulder lightly touched his, there was a profound human familiarity in the gesture, a reminder that touch could heal, not just comfort. Hours passed. Soraya gradually relaxed, her breathing deepening as warmth spread through her limbs again. Corvin stayed awake, staring at the firelight flickering across the wooden walls. He thought about how life brought strangers together in the most unexpected ways, how storms revealed truths that sunlight hid,